Chapter 4, the Gospel of Mark. Mark has 7 sections that are separated by 6 transitional statements. Now you can see these 7 sections in your textbook, and you can see the transitions that are marked there in these verses. Now this slide shows us the 7-part outline of Mark, the preliminaries of the ministry, then the first part of the Galilean ministry, second part of the Galilean ministry, and the concluding phase of Galilee. Continuing, we see the way of glory and suffering, the final ministry in Jerusalem, and the passion narrative and the empty tomb narratives. As we consider who authored this book, according to Papias, Mark wrote the gospel from the information he obtained from Peter. So the question is, who is Mark? Well, there are several possibilities here. He could be John Mark, that we see in the Acts and is mentioned in Colossians, Philemon, and 2 Timothy, even 1 Peter. He could be the cousin of Barnabas. We know that he traveled with Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, and then this Mark turned back, and he was also present with Paul during his Roman imprisonment, and he was with Peter during his Roman imprisonment. Many think that Mark was there in Rome, and that if we take Papias' account, that Peter is the one who gave Mark the other information he needed to put the gospel together. So we must ask ourselves, was Mark then dependent upon the preaching of Peter? There's a vividness and detail in Mark's story that give an indication of a testimony of an eyewitness. It just has that ring to it, that he's giving you this eyewitness account. The critique of his disciples in Mark is so stark that it seems likely that it came from an apostle. And Mark's gospel follows a very similar pattern to Peter's preaching in Acts, according to C.H. Dodd. Remember, C.H. Dodd's the scholar who discovered the kerygma, the elements of the gospel in preaching. So we see that Mark has a close relationship to Peter, as is evidenced by Peter's reference to him as my son in 1 Peter 5:13. So where was the Gospel of Mark written? One possibility has been suggested in Egypt, according to a letter that was found by Morton Smith in a monastery in Alexandria, Egypt. It mentions that Mark was in Rome, that he came to Egypt, and he wrote this Gnostic gospel. Well, the authenticity of the letter has been questioned, but even if it is authentic, it does place Mark in Rome earlier. Syria has been suggested, Antioch in Syria. Galilee has been suggested over in Palestine, but the strongest evidence is the Roman connection that we have. The Anti-Marcionite prologue mentions Mark in the regions of Italy. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria also suggests the same. There are a number of Latinisms in the gospel itself, and the mention of Simon of Cyrene's sons, Alexander and Rufus. And of course, Mark, when writing to the Roman church, Paul greets a guy named Rufus. Apparently, the Gentile audience of the gospel is more strength there. Many allusions to suffering, which would be appropriate to this gospel if the church was under great persecution. Then 1 Peter 5:13, Peter locates Mark in Rome. And lastly, the connection with the important early center of Christianity, which is Rome, would give an indication for the gospel's rapid acceptance. And here's the evidence for Galilee. And again, here are the arguments for the Antioch version of provenance. And here's the evidence for Galilee. And here's the evidence for Rome as the place of writing for this great gospel. You can see the evidence here, the allusions to suffering and the Neronian persecutions in the 60s. Peter's reference, many connections to this early center of Christianity, and also you put all these together, the weight seems to bring it to Rome. Now the date itself has been an interesting discussion. Torrey puts it in the 40s, claiming the abomination that causes desolation from Mark 13:14 is a direct reference to the image set up in the Jerusalem temple by Caligula in AD 40. The identification of Qumran fragments, 7Q5, and so forth, have been connected to the Gospel of Mark. Now, Carson and Moo would argue against the 40s, stating that Torrey's identification of the abomination of Caligula, very unlikely. Scholars contest the identification of these Qumran fragments with the Gospel of Mark, and Peter was not in Rome in the 40s. Now, Peter was in Rome at the beginning of the mid-50s, and Acts ends approximately AD 62. So if this is when the book of Acts was actually written, Luke depended upon Mark. Then Mark must have been written sometime before this. Now the 60s, the earliest traditions favor this date for Mark because it's after the death of Peter. Peter was in Rome in the mid-50s, and Mark does have this emphasis upon persecution. It seems to favor a date during or right after the Neronian persecution of Christians in AD 65. The persecution of Christians wasn't limited to Rome during the 60s. Mark, though largely silent on these details about Nero and the persecutions of the Christians, would support this. Mark 13 is not specific enough to suggest any historical situation. Couple that with the reflection that Mark appears to have this historical situation prior to the Roman entrance into Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. However, there are other early traditions that point to a date during Peter's lifetime. Now, for those who would take a 70s date, Mark 13 seems to reflect an experience of sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans. However, Jesus' predictions are more parallel really to Old Testament Jewish imagery than they are to any specific detail of what happened historically in 70 AD in Jerusalem. The persecution of Christians wasn't limited to Rome during the 60s. Mark, though largely silent on these details about Nero and the persecutions of the Christians, would support this. Mark 13 is not specific enough to suggest any historical situation. Now, for those who would take a 70s date, Mark 13 seems to reflect an experience of sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans. However, Jesus' predictions are more parallel really to Old Testament Jewish imagery than they are to any specific detail of what happened historically in 70 AD in Jerusalem. Also, to take a 70s date would assume that Jesus could not have accurately predicted what would happen in 70 AD. Well, who is Mark's audience? Well, it appears to be predominantly a Gentile audience, most likely Roman, is our conclusion that's beginning to emerge from our considerations here. Most of Mark's audience would have had the gospel read to them. So with all these differences of opinion, what's our conclusion? Well, most likely Mark was written sometime late 50s or early 60s during Peter's imprisonment or very soon after his death. Well, who is Mark's audience? Well, it appears to be predominantly a Gentile audience, most likely Roman, is our conclusion that's beginning to emerge from our considerations here. Most of Mark's audience would have had the gospel read to them. As we consider the purpose of this gospel, we see a strong Christology. Up until Mark 8:26, he's emphasizing Jesus' miraculous power as Son of God. After 8:27, Mark emphasizes Jesus as the suffering Son of God. Jesus as Messiah can only be properly understood in light of this suffering. Another key purpose is discipleship. Following the suffering Son of God. Believers must follow Jesus through suffering, humiliation, persecution, and, if need be, death. History and evangelism are two more purposes of this gospel: to provide an accurate account and to arm the Christian readers with the good news of salvation. Now, there are two significant textual variants that we need to say a word or two about. They occur, one in the front of the gospel, and there's one at the end of the gospel. Now, the term Son of God is omitted in a few early manuscripts. They're in verse 1:1. Now, it's problematic, but it seems more likely that these words were omitted in a few manuscripts than that scribes later added these words. Now, for this next section to really make sense to you, it would be very beneficial if you would open your Bible to Mark 16, verse 9 and 20, and see this. So, you may want to pause this tape and grab your Bible. All right. Now, some of the earliest manuscripts stop at 16:8, and other manuscripts have this addition from 9 to 20. So here's the dilemma. The earliest and better manuscripts don't have these verses. And then these verses that are added in the later manuscripts have a different vocabulary. They don't flow naturally from 6:8. Jerome and Eusebius were aware the best manuscripts didn't contain these verses, and these manuscripts, there are manuscripts with a different, shorter ending. So what do we make of this? Another possibility is that Mark wrote the longer ending, as the majority of manuscripts attest, and hence the Textus Receptus would take this ending. Another possibility is that Peter dictated a long version and a short version to share with different audiences. Well, what do you think? Carson thinks that third possibility is that Mark just simply stopped right there. At any rate, the longer ending brings in a resurrection. So if a scribe later on thought that, well, you've got to have a resurrection because all the other gospels did, right? But then, if you take that, then you also have the challenge of answering why he brings in, verse 18, picking up serpents and drinking deadly poison. So this is a really interesting textual variant, and one that is quite the conundrum. And so you have to decide which one of these possibilities you think is the reason for the long and the short endings. Well, there are three distinct possibilities. Number one, Mark may have intended to write more, but he just was prevented from doing so. Two, Mark may have written a longer ending, but the ending was lost accidentally during transmission. Or number three, Mark may have intended to end his gospel at 16:8, thereby refusing to comment on the significance of the history he narrates. Carson thinks this is most likely. Another possibility is that Mark wrote the longer ending, as the majority of manuscripts attest, and hence the Textus Receptus would take this ending. Another possibility is that Peter dictated a long version and a short version to share with different audiences. Well, what do you think? Carson thinks that third possibility is that Mark just simply stopped right there. At any rate, the longer ending brings in a resurrection. So if a scribe later on thought that, well, you've got to have a resurrection because all the other gospels did, right? But then, if you take that, then you also have the challenge of answering why he brings in, verse 18, picking up serpents and drinking deadly poison. So this is a really interesting textual variant, and one that is quite the conundrum. And so you have to decide which one of these possibilities you think is the reason for the long and the short endings. And last of all, the contribution of Mark. Mark is the creator of the gospel. It's literary form. We owe much to him for that. Mark is inextricably tied Christian faith to historical events, and he emphasizes the great importance of Jesus as the suffering Son of God for Christian theology and discipleship.